The morning air carried a chill as Richard Hayes stepped out of his sleek black Bentley. The cemetery was quiet, save for the distant rumble of city traffic and birds calling from the oak trees that lined the pathways. Richard adjusted his tailored coat and nodded to his driver, who remained by the car, understanding his boss's need for privacy. At 52, Richard had everything money could buy: a technology empire worth billions, homes across 3 continents, and more luxury items than he could use in a lifetime. Yet here, walking through rows of headstones with a bouquet of white lilies clutched in his hand, he felt as poor as the day he was born. 3 years. 3 years since Catherine had been laid to rest beneath the marble headstone that now appeared before him. The inscription remained as sharp as his grief. Catherine Marie Hayes, beloved wife and humanitarian. The dates below marked a life cut short at 46. Too young, too soon, too unfair. Richard knelt carefully, mindful of the damp ground beneath his knees, not caring about the expensive fabric of his suit pants. Some things mattered more than clothes. He placed the lilies gently against the stone and traced his fingers over her name. "Morning, Katie," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "The house still feels empty without you. Your garden is blooming, though. Those roses you planted are fighting their way back, stubborn just like you." The one-sided conversations never got easier, but they were all he had left. Each visit, he would update her on business developments, tell her about charity events he attended in her honor, and promise, again and again, that he was doing okay. Today's visit marked 3 years exactly since the cancer finally took her, after a battle that had seemed both endless and far too brief. As Richard spoke softly about the children's hospital wing that now bore Catherine's name, a sound caught his attention, the unmistakable cry of a baby. He paused, surprised. The cemetery was usually deserted during his early morning visits, especially on weekdays. The cry came again, followed by another, slightly different in pitch. 2 babies? Richard stood slowly, his knees protesting after kneeling on the hard ground. He glanced around until his eyes fell on a figure several rows away, partially hidden behind a large family monument. A young woman sat on the ground, a weathered backpack beside her, trying to comfort 2 infants bundled against her chest in what looked like a homemade carrier, fashioned from a blanket. Her clothes were clean but visibly worn, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Even from this distance, Richard could see the exhaustion in how her shoulders slumped. He turned back to Catherine's grave, intending to finish his private moment, but the woman's presence nagged at him. She clearly wasn't here to interrupt his grieving. She had her own visit to make, and with twins, no less. Richard remembered how Catherine had always stopped to help parents struggling with children, offering a kind word or helping hand when others would walk by. "You'd be telling me to check on her, wouldn't you?" he murmured to the headstone. With a deep breath, he stood up straight and brushed off his pants. "I'll be back next week, love." Richard took a few steps toward the woman but stopped short, not wanting to frighten her. She was speaking softly to the headstone before her, unaware of his approach. One of the babies had quieted, but the other still fussed against her chest. "Shh, Lily, please," the woman whispered, gently bouncing. "Just a few more minutes with Grandma, then we'll find somewhere warm." Her voice carried a gentle lilt, tired but patient. Richard hesitated. He was not a man who typically involved himself in strangers' business. Since Catherine's death, he had retreated further into his work, letting his executive assistant handle most human interactions. The thought of approaching this woman made him uncomfortable, but something held him in place, perhaps the memory of his wife's compassion, or the sight of those tiny bundled babies on a cold morning. The woman shifted, and Richard could now see the grave she sat before. Unlike the elaborate monuments surrounding it, including Catherine's, this one was simple, a basic headstone with minimal engraving. The woman reached out to touch it with her free hand, much as Richard had done minutes earlier with his wife's stone. "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice just loud enough for Richard to overhear. "The shelter's full again. I've tried everything you taught me, but it's so hard with the twins." Richard felt like an intruder listening to her private pain, but couldn't make himself walk away. The baby started crying again, joined quickly by the second one. The young woman's shoulders began to shake slightly. "I'm trying to be strong for them," she whispered to the grave, words nearly lost beneath the baby's cries. "Just like you taught me. But I'm so tired, Mom. Something in her words cracked through Richard's carefully maintained composure. How many times had he sat at Catherine's grave saying similar things? How many times had he wondered how to keep going when everything felt impossible? The woman stood suddenly, wiping her eyes with her sleeve and adjusting the babies against her chest. She picked up her backpack with effort, slinging it over one shoulder before bending to place something small on the grave. A single wildflower, probably picked from the cemetery grounds. As she turned to leave, Richard saw her face clearly for the first time. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. Despite her obvious exhaustion, there was a quiet dignity in how she held herself, chin lifted slightly as if facing the world head-on. One of the babies let out another cry, and she murmured softly, "I know, Alex, I'm hungry too." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. This young woman wasn't just visiting a grave. She and her babies were hungry. The contrast between her reality and his own was stark. This morning, he had barely touched the gourmet breakfast his chef had prepared before heading out in his luxury car to visit his wife's $50,000 headstone. Richard cleared his throat. "Excuse me," the woman startled, clutching her babies closer instinctively as she turned toward his voice. Up close, Richard could see the wariness in her eyes, the look of someone who had learned to be suspicious of unexpected attention. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "I couldn't help overhearing. The babies. Are you all right?" She straightened her posture, pride visible in the set of her jaw. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. Richard nodded, respecting her dignity. "My name is Richard. I was visiting my wife." He gestured vaguely toward Catherine's grave. Some of the tension left the young woman's shoulders. "I'm Abby," she said after a moment. "These are Alex and Lily." She adjusted the blanket to reveal two tiny faces, eyes wide with that newborn blue, no more than a few months old. "Twins," Richard said, a sad smile crossing his face. "Catherine, my wife, always wanted children. We tried for years, but—" He trailed off, surprised at himself for sharing such personal information with a stranger. Abby's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry about your wife." 3 years today," Richard said, the words still difficult to say aloud. "And your—" He glanced toward the simple headstone she had been visiting. "My mom," Abby replied, looking back at the grave. "5 months ago, cancer." The word hung in the air between them, the same enemy that had taken Catherine. Richard noticed Abby shift her weight from one foot to another, clearly exhausted but too proud to complain. "There's a cafe just outside the cemetery gates," Richard found himself saying. "Would you and the babies like to get something to eat? It's a cold morning to be out here." Suspicion flashed across Abby's face again, and Richard quickly added, "No obligation, just a warm place to sit for a while, in memory of those we're visiting today." For a moment he thought she would refuse. Then Lily began to cry again, and the decision seemed to make itself. "That would be nice," Abby said quietly. "Thank you." As they walked slowly toward the cemetery gates, Richard kept a respectful distance. He didn't know why he had approached this young mother, or what would come of their chance meeting. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 years he wasn't thinking solely about his own grief. Catherine would have approved, he thought. She always said that helping others was the best medicine for a broken heart. And as Richard watched Abby whisper soothingly to her fussing twins, he felt something shift inside him, a tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself since losing his wife. Some connections happen by chance. Some grief is shared by strangers. And sometimes healing begins in the most unexpected places. The small cafe across from the cemetery was nearly empty at this early hour. Richard held the door open as Abby stepped inside, the warm air wrapping around them like a blanket after the morning chill. A bell chimed softly above the door, and the scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. "Take any seat you'd like," Richard said, watching as Abby glanced around nervously. He noticed how she assessed each table, finally choosing one in the corner with a good view of both the door and the street outside. The habits of someone who had learned to be cautious, he thought. The twins had quieted somewhat in the warmth of the cafe, but one of them, Lily, Richard remembered, still whimpered softly. Abby struggled to settle into the booth while keeping both babies secure against her chest. "May I help?" Richard asked, gesturing to her backpack. After a moment's hesitation, Abby nodded. Thank you. He placed the worn backpack beside her, noticing its light weight. For someone caring for 2 infants, she traveled with remarkably little. An older waitress approached their table, her eyebrows rising slightly at the unusual pair. A man in an expensive suit sitting across from a clearly struggling young mother with twins. But her face quickly softened at the sight of the babies. What can I get for you folks this morning? She asked, pen poised over her notepad. Richard looked to Abby. Order whatever you'd like. Abby's eyes darted to the menu prices and Richard saw her shoulders tense. Just a cup of tea, please, she said quietly. And to eat? The waitress prompted. The tea is fine, thank you. Richard understood pride when he saw it. We'll have 2 breakfast specials, he said to the waitress. And a pot of tea. And coffee for me, please. After the waitress left, an awkward silence fell between them. Richard wasn't used to making small talk anymore. His days were filled with business meetings where conversation had clear purpose and direction. Personal connection was something he had largely abandoned after Catherine died. Abby broke the silence first. You didn't have to order food for me. I'm hungry, Richard replied simply. And food always tastes better with company. One of the babies began to fuss again, tiny fists waving in the air. Abby shifted, trying to comfort both infants at once. How old are they? Richard asked, grateful for the natural topic of conversation. 4 months next week, Abby said, a hint of pride breaking through her exhaustion. Alex was born 7 minutes before Lily. They're beautiful, Richard said, and meant it. Despite the circumstances, the babies looked well cared for, their cheeks round and healthy. Whatever struggles Abby faced, she clearly put her children first. Do you have children? Abby asked, then immediately looked regretful. I'm sorry. You mentioned earlier that you and your wife... No, it's all right, Richard assured her. We tried for many years. Catherine had several miscarriages. The doctors eventually told us it wasn't going to happen. The familiar ache returned as he spoke of those lost possibilities. Catherine threw herself into charity work after that, especially with children. Abby nodded in understanding. My mom was like that too, always helping others, even when we barely had enough ourselves. The waitress returned with their drinks, setting down the teapot and cup for Abby, and a large mug of coffee for Richard. The rich aroma filled the space between them. As Abby prepared her tea one-handed, Richard noticed the slight tremble in her fingers. How long had it been since she'd had a proper meal or a full night's sleep? He wondered. You mentioned your mom passed away 5 months ago, Richard said carefully. Cancer, like my wife. Abby nodded, her eyes fixed on her tea. Pancreatic. By the time they found it, it was already stage 4. She took a slow breath. I was 7 months pregnant when she was diagnosed. The doctors gave her 6 months, but she was determined to meet her grandchildren. And she did? Richard asked softly. A small smile touched Abby's lips. She held on for 3 weeks after they were born, just long enough to hold them both. Her voice wavered slightly. She named them, actually. Alexander after her father and Lily after her favorite flower. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Catherine had loved lilies. They had been in her wedding bouquet, and now he brought them to her grave every week. What about the twins' father? He asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw Abby's expression harden. He left when I was 5 months pregnant, she said flatly. Once he found out they were twins, he said it was too much responsibility. He changed his number, moved away. No one's heard from him since. Richard felt a flash of anger toward this unknown man who had abandoned his family when they needed him most. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling inadequate. The waitress arrived with their food, plates piled with eggs, bacon, toast, and potatoes. She set them down with a smile and a wink for the babies. Let me know if you need anything else, honey, she said to Abby before walking away. Abby stared at the food as if it might disappear. I can't remember the last time I saw a breakfast this size, she admitted. Please eat while it's hot, Richard encouraged. I can hold one of the babies if that would help. Surprise flickered across Abby's face. After a moment's consideration, she carefully extracted Lily from the makeshift carrier. She's the calmer one, Abby explained, showing Richard how to support the baby's head as she transferred her into his arms. The weight of the tiny human being against his chest caught Richard off guard. He had held babies before, friends' children, employees' newborns, but this felt different somehow. Lily blinked up at him with solemn eyes, her tiny mouth forming an O of surprise at the stranger holding her. "Hello there, Lily," he said softly, feeling strangely self-conscious. The baby's hand escaped from her blanket and her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. Something shifted in Richard's chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Across the table, Abby began to eat, trying to pace herself despite her obvious hunger. She kept one arm securely around Alex while managing her fork with the other hand. "How have you been managing?" Richard asked carefully. "Since your mother passed?" Abby took a sip of tea before answering. "We were living in Mom's apartment. I had to drop out of nursing school when she got sick to take care of her. After she paused. After she died, I couldn't keep up with the rent on savings alone. We stayed as long as we could, but..." She shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes. "How long have you been without housing?" Richard asked, the business part of his brain automatically calculating timelines. 3 weeks, Abby admitted. "The shelters are always full. Sometimes we get a spot for a night or two, but never consecutively. Last night She stopped, as if suddenly aware of how much she was sharing with a stranger. "Last night?" Richard prompted gently. "We slept in the hospital waiting room," Abby said, her voice dropping. "It's warm there, and if you look like you're waiting for news about someone, they usually leave you alone for a few hours." Richard tried to imagine this young woman, exhausted and alone, cradling her twins in a hospital waiting room chair all night. The contrast with his own evening, a quiet dinner in his mansion, followed by a movie in his home theater and sleep in his king-sized bed, was stark and uncomfortable. Little Lily squirmed in his arms, making soft, gurgling sounds. Richard adjusted his hold, surprised at how natural it felt after just a few minutes. "You're good with her," Abby observed, a hint of surprise in her voice. "Beginner's luck," Richard replied with a small smile. "Or maybe she's just an easy baby." "She's usually the fussy one," Abby said, returning his smile. "She must like you." They lapsed into a more comfortable silence as Abby continued eating. Richard found himself studying the young mother across from him, the determined set of her shoulders despite her exhaustion, the gentle way she handled Alex, the careful way she made her food last. She reminded him oddly of himself in his early days, before the wealth, before Catherine, when he was fighting for a foothold in the world with nothing but determination. And she reminded him, painfully, of Catherine, the same compassionate eyes, the same selflessness. His wife would have moved mountains to help someone like Abby. As if sensing his thoughts, Abby looked up from her plate. "Thank you for this," she said simply. "Not just the food. It's been lonely since Mom died. It's nice to talk to someone." "I understand loneliness," Richard replied, surprising himself with his honesty. "Even in a room full of people, it's been lonely since Catherine died." Lily began to fuss in his arms, her little face scrunching up with displeasure. "She's probably hungry," Abby said, reaching for the baby. "I should feed them soon." As Richard handed Lily back, their fingers brushed briefly. The touch, simple human contact, made him realize how isolated he had become, how he had walled himself off from genuine connection. "Abby," he said, making a decision that surprised even himself. "I have a proposition for you if you'll hear me out." She looked at him cautiously, the wariness returning to her eyes. "It's nothing inappropriate," Richard hastened to add. "I have a guest house on my property. It's sitting empty. You and the twins could stay there while you get back on your feet." The words hung in the air between them, as unexpected to him as they clearly were to her, but as soon as he said them, Richard knew it was what Catherine would have wanted. What she would have done herself had she been here. Abby's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion to uncertainty. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Richard considered his answer carefully. "Because today is the anniversary of my wife's death, and helping you feels like honoring her memory. Because those babies deserve a safe place to sleep, and because sometimes the universe puts people in our path for a reason." Outside the cafe window, the morning sun had fully risen, casting golden light across their table. In Richard's mind, he could almost hear Catherine's voice approving his decision. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something like purpose stirring within him, a tiny crack in the wall of grief he had built around his heart. Abby sat in the back seat of Richard's Bentley, the twins secured beside her in car seats that his driver, Thomas, had somehow produced within 30 minutes of a phone call. The leather seats felt impossibly soft beneath her, the car gliding so smoothly along the road that both babies had fallen asleep almost immediately. She still couldn't believe she had said yes to a stranger's offer. Every warning she'd ever heard about being careful, about not trusting too easily, echoed in her mind. Yet something about Richard Hayes felt genuine. Perhaps it was the sadness that lingered in his eyes, or how gently he had held Lily, or maybe just the simple fact that they had met while visiting graves of loved ones lost to the same disease. "We're about 10 minutes from the house," Richard said from the front passenger seat, turning slightly to look back at her. "Is there anything you need to know before we arrive?" Abby adjusted Alex's blanket, buying time as she considered what to ask. There were 1,000 questions swirling in her mind, but most felt too personal or too suspicious. Finally, she settled on, "How big is this guest house?" A small smile touched Richard's lips. "It's comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a living area, kitchen. It was originally built for Catherine's parents when they visited from England. They're both gone now, so it's been empty for a few years." "And you're sure it's no trouble?" Abby asked for what felt like the 100th time. "No trouble at all," Richard assured her. "The house is cleaned regularly, even when empty. It's just sitting there." Thomas, the driver, caught Abby's eye in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Hayes has 17 properties worldwide, miss," he said with a hint of amusement. "The guest house is hardly missed." Richard shot his driver a look that was half exasperation, half amusement. "Thank you for that clarification, Thomas. 17 properties." Abby tried to wrap her mind around such wealth. 3 weeks ago, she'd been grateful to find a sheltered doorway for the night. The car turned onto a private road lined with tall maple trees, their leaves just beginning to show hints of autumn gold. After about half a mile, they approached a security gate where a guard stepped out of a small building. He nodded respectfully to Richard as the gate swung open. "You have security?" Abby asked, suddenly feeling even more out of place. "Standard for the area," Richard replied with a shrug that suggested this was perfectly normal. "Nothing to worry about." As they continued up the winding driveway, Abby caught her first glimpse of Richard's house through the trees. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a house, it was a mansion that looked like it belonged in a movie, with its stone facade and massive columns flanking the entrance. "That's your home?" she blurted out before she could stop herself. Richard glanced back, seeming to see his house through her eyes for a moment. "It's too big for one person," he admitted. "Most days I only use a small portion of it." The car continued past the main house, following a stone path that curved around manicured gardens until they reached a smaller building, set apart from the main residence. Though Richard had called it a guest house, to Abby it looked like a luxurious cottage from a fairy tale, with window boxes full of flowers and a charming red door. "Here we are," Richard said as Thomas brought the car to a stop. Abby remained frozen in her seat, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's turn of events. 12 hours ago, she had been huddled in a hospital waiting room, wondering where she and the twins would sleep tonight. Now she was sitting in a billionaire's car about to stay in a house nicer than anywhere she had ever lived. "Abby," Richard's voice broke through her thoughts. He had already stepped out of the car and opened her door. "Are you all right?" She blinked rapidly, fighting back unexpected tears. "Yeah, sorry. It's just a lot to take in." Richard nodded in understanding. "One step at a time. Let's get you and the twins inside, and then we can figure out the rest." With practiced efficiency, Thomas helped transfer the sleeping babies from the car seats to Abby's arms. Richard led the way to the cottage door, producing a key from his pocket. "I don't think it's been used since Mrs. Hayes passed," Thomas commented quietly as Richard unlocked the door. "But the cleaning staff still comes through twice a month." The interior of the guest house was even more beautiful than its exterior. Open and airy, with hardwood floors, comfortable furniture, and large windows that let in streams of natural light. A small fireplace dominated one wall of the living room, while the kitchen gleamed with spotless appliances that looked like they had never been used. "The bedrooms are this way," Richard said, gesturing down a hallway to the right. "The main one has a crib that was meant for visitors with children." He led them to a spacious bedroom with a queen-sized bed covered in a soft-looking blue quilt. In the corner stood a wooden crib, simple but elegant. "We can get another crib delivered this afternoon," Richard said, noticing Abby's glance at her twins. "Or there's a portable one in the closet that could work temporarily." "This is..." Abby struggled to find words that could express her feelings without sounding overly dramatic or painfully grateful. "This is very kind of you." Richard waved away her thanks. "The kitchen should be stocked with basics. Coffee, tea, some non-perishables. I'll have groceries delivered later today. Is there anything specific you or the babies need?" The question was so ordinary, so practical, that it finally broke through Abby's stunned disbelief. This was really happening. A stranger, a billionaire stranger, was offering her not just shelter but comfort, security, food. "Diapers," she said, finding her voice. "And formula. We're almost out. I'll take care of it," Richard promised. "I have some calls to make, but I'll check back in a few hours to see if you need anything else. Make yourself at home, Abby." As Richard turned to leave, Abby shifted Alex in her arms. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the cafe. "Really?" Richard paused at the door, his expression thoughtful. "When Catherine died, I shut myself off from the world. I buried myself in work, in accumulating more wealth that I didn't need and couldn't enjoy. This morning at the cemetery, hearing you speak to your mother's grave." He paused, searching for words. "It reminded me that grief is universal, and that Catherine would be disappointed in how I've handled mine." He met Abby's eyes directly. "I'm not doing this out of pity if that's what you're worried about. I'm doing it because for the first time in 3 years, I felt something other than numbness or pain. And because Catherine would have done the same without a second thought." With that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Alone in the beautiful guest house, Abby carefully laid the twins down on the bed, surrounding them with pillows to keep them from rolling. They continued to sleep, peaceful in a way they rarely were in the noisy shelters or cold car back seat where they'd spent too many nights. She walked through the rooms again, running her fingers over smooth countertops and soft fabrics, half expecting to wake up and find herself back in the hospital waiting room. But the guest house remained solid around her, real and unexpected as a miracle. In the living room, Abby noticed a framed photograph on a side table, a woman with auburn hair and a bright smile, her arms around a younger version of Richard. Catherine, she presumed. The woman's eyes seemed kind, even in a photograph. "Thank you," Abby whispered to the picture. Back in the main house, Richard sat in his home office, staring out the window toward the guest house. Thomas entered quietly, setting a cup of coffee on the desk. "Will there be anything else, sir?" the driver asked. Richard shook his head. "No, thank you, Thomas." As the driver turned to leave, Richard added, "Actually, wait. Could you ask Mrs. Chen to put together some baby essentials? Whatever she thinks would be useful for 4-month-old twins. And have it delivered to the guest house this afternoon." "Of course." "Sir?" Thomas hesitated, then added, "If I may say so, sir, Mrs. Hayes would approve of what you're doing." Richard smiled faintly. "That's what I keep telling myself." After Thomas left, Richard turned to his computer and began typing. A quick search for single mother resources yielded dozens of organizations. He made a note to look into them more thoroughly later. Next, he opened his calendar and canceled 3 meetings scheduled for the following day. For the first time since taking over as CEO after Catherine's death, something felt more important than work. Out of curiosity, he pulled up the security camera feed from outside the guest house. Through the grainy black and white image, he could see Abby standing on the small porch, her face tilted up toward the sun, eyes closed. Even through the security footage, he could see her shoulders relax for perhaps the first time since he'd met her. Richard switched off the monitor, feeling suddenly like an intruder. He had offered Abby shelter, not surveillance. He would need to remember that, to respect her privacy and dignity while still providing the help she clearly needed. He picked up a framed photo from his desk. Catherine on their last anniversary, thin from chemotherapy but still radiant, still fighting. "I think I understand now," he said softly to the photograph. "What you were always trying to tell me about purpose, about connection." Through the open window, he heard the distant cry of one of the twins, followed by Abby's gentle voice soothing the baby back to sleep. Sounds of life in a house that had been too quiet for too long. Richard set down the photograph and began making a list. Diapers, formula, clothes for the babies, clothes for Abby, a second crib, baby monitors, a stroller. The list grew longer as he thought of more necessities. Money had never seemed more useful than in this moment, when it could provide immediate comfort to a struggling young mother and her babies. For the first time in 3 years, Richard felt a glimmer of the man he used to be, the man Catherine had loved. Not just the successful businessman, but the person who cared about more than the bottom line, the person who could see beyond his own grief to recognize someone else's struggles. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was a start. 2 weeks passed quicker than Abby could have imagined. The guest house had become a haven for her and the twins, who seemed to flourish in the peaceful environment. Each morning she woke to sunlight streaming through curtains nicer than any she'd ever owned. The babies cooing in their matching cribs that had been delivered the day after their arrival. Richard had been true to his word, providing everything they needed without making Abby feel like a charity case. Groceries appeared regularly along with baby supplies. When she'd shyly asked about laundry facilities, he'd shown her the washer and dryer tucked away in a small utility room she hadn't even noticed. On this particular morning, Abby sat on the porch of the guest house enjoying a rare moment of quiet while both twins napped inside. She cradled a mug of coffee between her hands, watching leaves drift from the maple trees that surrounded the property. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to think beyond just surviving the day. The sound of footsteps on the stone path made her look up. Richard approached, dressed more casually than she had yet seen him, in jeans and a sweater. He carried a tablet under one arm. "Good morning," he called as he neared the porch. "Am I interrupting?" Abby shook her head. "Not at all. The twins are taking their morning nap." "A miracle of timing," Richard said with a smile, climbing the steps to join her. He gestured to the empty chair beside her. "May I?" "Of course." Richard sat down, placing the tablet on the small table between them. "I wanted to talk to you about something, if you have a few minutes." A flutter of anxiety rose in Abby's chest. Was this the moment, he asked, when she would be leaving? She had known this arrangement couldn't last forever, but the thought of going back to shelters and uncertainty made her stomach knot. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Richard seemed to sense her concern. "It's nothing bad," he assured her. "Actually, I hope it might be helpful." He tapped the tablet screen, bringing it to life, then handed it to her. "I've been doing some research. There's a program through my company's foundation that supports people returning to education, full scholarships, living stipends, childcare assistance. You mentioned you were in nursing school before your mother got sick." Abby stared at the screen, which displayed information about a scholarship program she'd never heard of. "Your company has a foundation?" Richard nodded. "Catherine started it. Education was important to her." "And you think I could qualify for this?" Abby asked, trying not to let hope rise too quickly. "I know you would." The program was specifically designed for people whose education was interrupted by life circumstances beyond their control. Richard leaned forward slightly. "You wouldn't have to move out or find other accommodations. The guest house could remain your home while you complete your studies." Abby's hands trembled slightly as she set the tablet down. "I don't know what to say. It's more than I could have hoped for." "You don't have to decide right away," Richard said. "Take some time to think about it." Abby looked out at the beautiful grounds, then back to Richard. "Why me?" she asked quietly.
"There must be thousands of people who could use this help." Richard was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant.
"When Catherine was sick, we had a team of nurses. One in particular, her name was Nancy. She didn't just tend to Catherine's medical needs. She listened to her fears, held her hand through the worst pain, made her laugh even on terrible days." He looked back at Abby. "Good nurses change lives. Catherine used to say they were angels disguised as regular people." He smiled slightly. "And I've seen how you are with the twins. Your patience, your care, even when you're exhausted. Those are qualities that can't be taught." A baby's cry floated through the open window of the guest house. Abby recognized Lily's distinctive wail. "That's my cue," she said, standing up. "Would you like to come in? I made banana bread yesterday." Richard looked surprised by the invitation, then pleased. "I'd like that." Inside, Abby went to the nursery where Lily was fully awake and fussing while Alex still slept soundly. She lifted Lily from her crib, soothing her with gentle bounces. "Someone woke up hungry," she commented as she carried the baby back to the living room. Richard stood somewhat awkwardly in the middle of the room, looking around at the small touches Abby had added to make the space her own. A colorful blanket draped over the sofa, baby toys organized in a basket, wildflowers in a mason jar on the dining table. "It looks different in here," he observed. "More lived in." "I hope that's okay," Abby said, suddenly conscious that she had been making herself too comfortable in a home that wasn't hers. It's better this way, Richard assured her. It was meant to be a home, not a museum piece. Abby settled on the sofa with Lily preparing to feed her. The banana bread is in the kitchen if you want to help yourself. Richard nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. She heard cupboard doors opening as he looked for plates. Second cupboard on the left, she called out. Found them, he replied. A moment later, he returned with 2 slices of banana bread on small plates. This looks homemade. It is. Your housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, brought me baking supplies when I mentioned I used to bake with my mom. Abby accepted the plate he offered, balancing it on the sofa arm while holding Lily. It's my mom's recipe. Richard took a bite of the bread. It's delicious. Thank you. Abby watched as he took another bite, then added, Mrs. Chen seems very fond of you. She's told me stories about you and Catherine. Richard raised an eyebrow. Has she now? Should I be worried? Abby laughed. Nothing too embarrassing. She told me about the time Catherine filled your home office with balloons for your birthday. A genuine smile spread across Richard's face at the memory. 342 balloons. I counted them as I popped them. Catherine said there was one for each million the company had made that year. His eyes took on a faraway look. She always found ways to make sure I didn't take myself too seriously. They settled into comfortable conversation as Lily finished feeding and began to doze against Abby's shoulder. Alex woke soon after, and to Abby's surprise, Richard offered to hold him while she prepared his bottle. When she returned from the kitchen, she found Richard sitting in the rocking chair, speaking softly to Alex, who stared up at him with wide, curious eyes. I was just telling Alex about the stock market, Richard said with a hint of self-consciousness. It's never too early to learn financial literacy. Abby smiled as she handed him the bottle. I'm sure he found it fascinating. Richard tested the temperature of the formula on his wrist before offering it to Alex, who eagerly accepted. The practiced motion caught Abby's attention. You seem experienced with babies for someone who doesn't have children, she observed. A shadow passed over Richard's face. Catherine and I were foster parents for a brief time years ago. Twin boys, actually. They were with us for 8 months before being reunited with their mother. He gently adjusted Alex's position. We stayed in touch for a while. They'd be teenagers now. The revelation added another layer to her understanding of this complex man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. Is that why you stopped at the cemetery that day? Because the twins reminded you of them? Richard considered this, maybe subconsciously. But no, it was more what you said to your mother's grave, about trying to be strong for them. He met her eyes. It reminded me of something I would have said to Catherine. The simple honesty of his words touched Abby deeply. She had spent so many months feeling utterly alone in her grief and struggles. Finding someone who understood even partially felt like finally catching her breath after being underwater. I miss her every day, Abby admitted quietly. Sometimes I'll think of something funny to tell her, and then remember I can't. Richard nodded. That doesn't go away, but it changes, becomes less sharp over time. Does it really? She asked, needing to hear that the crushing weight of grief wouldn't always feel so heavy. It does, he assured her. There are still days when it hits me like it just happened. But there are also days now when I can remember Catherine and smile instead of feeling only pain. Alex had finished his bottle and was beginning to doze off in Richard's arms. Abby watched as the billionaire businessman gently patted the baby's back, completely at ease with the tiny human entrusted to his care. I've been thinking about your offer, Abby said after a moment. The scholarship, and? I want to accept, she said, the words bringing both relief and nervous anticipation. I want to finish my nursing degree. It's what my mom would have wanted, and it's what I want too. Richard smiled, the expression warming his usually serious face. I think that's a wonderful decision. But I don't want special treatment, Abby added firmly. If there's an application process, I want to go through it properly. If I'm going to do this, I want to know I earned it. Rather than being offended, Richard looked impressed. The foundation has a standard application process. All candidates are evaluated on merit and need. I can connect you with the program director, but the decision will be theirs. Thank you, Abby said, for everything. Richard looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms, then back to Abby. I should be thanking you. For what? For reminding me there's more to life than boardrooms and balance sheets, He carefully stood, cradling Alex against his chest. "Would you and the twins like to join me for dinner tonight? In the main house? Mrs. Chen has been asking to properly meet the babies." The invitation surprised Abby. In the 2 weeks they'd been staying in the guest house, Richard had kept a respectful distance, visiting occasionally but always briefly. "We'd like that," she said, realizing how much she had come to value his company. As Richard carefully transferred the sleeping Alex to her arms, their eyes met. In that moment, Abby recognized that something significant had shifted between them. No longer just a benefactor and recipient, but two people finding unexpected healing in each other's company. 6 o'clock? Richard suggested. 6 o'clock, Abby confirmed. After Richard left, Abby placed both sleeping twins in their cribs, then stood by the window watching his retreating figure as he walked back to the main house. She thought about her mother, about the strange twists life could take, about how sometimes help came from the most unexpected places. For the first time since her mother's death, Abby allowed herself to believe that perhaps the future held more than just struggle. Perhaps there was room for hope, for dreams, for building something new from the ashes of what had been lost. 6 months later, the first signs of spring were appearing across the estate grounds. Tiny green buds dotted the maple trees and early flowers pushed through the soil in the gardens. Inside the main house, another kind of renewal was taking place. "Is everyone ready?" Richard called up the grand staircase, checking his watch. "The guests will be arriving in 20 minutes. Abby appeared at the top of the stairs, looking almost unrecognizable from the exhausted young mother Richard had met at the cemetery half a year ago. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and the simple blue dress she wore complemented her eyes. Most noticeably different was her confident posture and the easy smile that now came readily to her face. "Coming," she called back, a baby balanced on each hip. At 10 months old, the twins had grown remarkably, their personalities becoming more distinct by the day. Alex, curious and outgoing, reached toward Richard at the bottom of the stairs. Lily, more thoughtful and observant, clung to Abby's shoulder, watching everything with serious eyes. Richard climbed the stairs to meet them halfway. "Here, let me take Alex before he launches himself down the stairs." "That boy has no fear." As he took the baby boy, Alex immediately grabbed Richard's tie, a habit that had ruined several expensive silk ties over the past months. "No, Fuddy," Richard said gently, disentangling the small fingers. "Remember our deal? You leave my ties alone and I'll let you play with my phone later." Abby laughed. "He's 10 months old. I don't think he remembers any deals." "Never too early to learn about honoring agreements," Richard replied with mock seriousness that made Abby roll her eyes. Together they descended the stairs, the four of them a picture that would have seemed impossible that cold morning in the cemetery. Richard led the way to the large living room where everything was prepared for the event. "Are you nervous?" he asked Abby as they surveyed the room. She adjusted Lily on her hip. "A little. It's a big day." "They're going to love you," Richard assured her. "All of you." The doorbell rang and Thomas appeared from the hallway. "The first guests have arrived, sir." "Thank you, Thomas," Richard said. "Show them in." As Thomas departed, Abby turned to Richard. "Should I take the twins to the nursery until the presentation starts?" "Absolutely not," Richard said firmly. "They're as much a part of this as anyone. Besides, Mrs. Chen would never forgive me if I hid her favorite babies away." As if summoned by her name, Mrs. Chen bustled into the room carrying a tray of appetizers. The housekeeper had become one of Abby's strongest supporters and the twins' honorary grandmother over the past months. "There are my little angels," she exclaimed, setting down the tray to tickle Lily's cheek. The usually serious baby rewarded her with a rare smile. "All ready for the big announcement?" Before Abby could answer, Thomas returned leading a group of people in business attire. Richard straightened, shifting into his role as host and CEO. "Welcome, everyone," he greeted them warmly. "Thank you for coming. Please help yourselves to refreshments while we wait for the others to arrive." Over the next 15 minutes, the room filled with people, board members from Richard's company, directors from his foundation, community leaders, and medical professionals from the local hospital. Abby moved among them with growing confidence, Alex now crawling happily in a cordoned-off area of the room while she held Lily. Richard watched her from across the room as she chatted with the head of nursing from the hospital, where she would begin her clinical rotations next semester. The transformation in Abby over the past 6 months had been remarkable. She had not only been accepted into the scholarship program, but had excelled in her return to nursing studies, impressing her professors with her dedication and natural abilities. More than that, she had blossomed as a person, regaining the confidence that grief and hardship had stolen from her. The nervous, wary young woman from the cemetery had grown into someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to speak up for herself and her children. When everyone had arrived, Richard tapped a spoon against his glass to call for attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward him. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "Many of you have been involved with the Catherine Hayes Foundation since its inception 5 years ago. Some of you knew my wife personally and understand how passionate she was about creating opportunities for those facing obstacles in their education and career paths." He paused, his eyes finding Abby's across the room. She gave him an encouraging nod. "Today, I'm proud to announce the launch of a new initiative under the foundation, the New Beginnings program." Richard gestured for Abby to join him. She handed Lily to Mrs. Chen and made her way to his side. "This program will specifically focus on supporting single parents who have been displaced or faced housing insecurity while pursuing education in medical fields," Richard continued. "It will provide not just tuition assistance but comprehensive support including housing, childcare, mentorship, and eventual job placement." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Richard smiled and placed a hand lightly on Abby's shoulder. "I'd like to introduce you to Abby Thompson, who has been instrumental in shaping this program." His voice softened slightly. "Abby and her twins came into my life by chance, or perhaps fate, 6 months ago. Her story, her determination, and her insights have been the inspiration for New Beginnings." Abby stepped forward. Her cheeks flushed but her eyes clear and confident. "Thank you, Richard," she said, before turning to address the room. 6 months ago, I was homeless with twin babies, having lost my mother to cancer and been forced to abandon my nursing studies. I had no idea that a visit to my mother's grave would change everything." She spoke clearly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "What I've learned is that sometimes the difference between despair and hope is just one person who sees your value. One person who believes in your potential. For me, that person was Richard." She gestured toward the program outlines that had been distributed to the guests. "The New Beginnings program aims to be that support for others like me, people with dreams and abilities who just need a bridge over troubled waters. As the program's first participant and now its co-director, I'm committed to ensuring it provides not just financial assistance but dignity and community." The room broke into applause. Richard watched Abby with pride as she continued explaining the details of the program, how participants would be selected, the various support services, the partnerships with local hospitals and universities. She had come so far from the exhausted young mother whispering desperate words at her mother's grave. After the presentation, as guests mingled and discussed the initiative, Richard found himself by the window, watching as Abby spoke animatedly with the hospital board members. Lily had made her way back to Abby and was perched on her hip, observing everything with her serious eyes, while Alex crawled determinedly toward a plate of cookies being guarded by Mrs. Chen. "She's quite remarkable," a voice said beside him. Richard turned to find Dr. Patricia Winters, the head of his foundation, joining him by the window. "She is," Richard agreed. "And so are you," Dr. Winters added. "I've known you for years, Richard, and I've never seen you like this. Not since Catherine." Richard didn't pretend to misunderstand. "She saved me as much as I helped her." Dr. Winters watched as Abby laughed at something one of the guests said. "The board is very impressed with the program. We think it has potential for national expansion, perhaps even international eventually." "That's the goal," Richard said. "Catherine always believed in creating ripple effects of positive change. She would be proud of this," Dr. Winters said gently. "Of you." As the party continued, Richard found himself thinking about the strange path that had led to this day. How a morning visit to a cemetery, a moment of shared grief, had opened a door he had kept firmly shut for 3 years. Later, after the guests had departed and the twins were tucked into their beds in the nursery that had been added to the main house, Richard and Abby sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I think it went well," Abby said, sipping her tea. The hospital board seemed especially interested in the mentorship component. "It went better than well," Richard assured her. "We've already received pledges for additional funding." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, The kind that comes from months of shared meals, conversations, and the daily rhythms of raising children together. I got a letter from the twins' father, Abby said suddenly. He found out about the foundation announcement somehow. Richard tensed. What did he want? To be part of their lives, Abby said, her voice carefully neutral. He says he's changed, that he regrets leaving. And what do you think? Richard asked, trying to keep his own opinions from coloring his tone. Abby looked out at the grounds that had become her home. I think people can change. I've seen it happen. She turned to meet his eyes. But I also think that family isn't always about blood. It's about who stays, who shows up day after day. Richard felt something in his chest expand. And what did you tell him? That he could meet the twins someday when they're older. That he forfeited his right to be their father when he walked away. But that doesn't mean he can't be something in their lives eventually. She set down her teacup. I also told him about you. About me. Richard echoed. Abby nodded. About how you've been there for us. How you've become family to us. The word hung in the air between them, full of meaning. Family. Something Richard had thought lost to him forever after Catherine's death. You know, he said after a moment, I've been thinking about the guest house. What about it? Abby asked. It's sitting empty now that you and the twins have rooms here. He looked at her directly. I was thinking we could convert it into the first residence for the New Beginnings program. A place where another parent and child could find their footing. Abby's eyes brightened. I think that's perfect. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, Richard thought about how a single moment at a cemetery had led here, to renewed purpose, to joy found in helping others, to a family created not by blood but by choice and circumstance. Catherine once told me, he said softly, that the measure of a life well lived isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you give away. Abby reached across the space between them and took his hand. She was right. Inside the house, one of the twins began to cry. Without discussion, they both rose to their feet, hands still linked as they went to comfort the child. In that simple, everyday moment, Richard felt the final pieces of his broken heart begin to heal, not erasing what was lost, but making room for what had been found.